Hello, my name is Vera Coleman, and I am delighted to be a part of the linked panels on Indigenous lands and visual rhetoric in Ecomedia. My talk is titled Decolonially Queer, Indigenous, Ecocriticism, Queer Ecologies, and Multispecies Relationships in Recent Latin American Film and Art. Indigenous communities of Latin America and around the world have for thousands of years developed sophisticated understandings of sexual diversity and gender performativity within and beyond the scope of the human. For example, ritual shape-shifting practices that traverse species lines are often associated with fluid, amorphous corporealities and sexualities. Such multi-species relationships and artistic forms that blur the boundaries between genders, sexualities, and orders of life can help us dismantle patriarchal and anthropocentric discourses about what constitutes the natural, while problematizing the Western categorizing regimes that bolster what decolonial scholar Walter Mignolo calls the colonial matrix of power. Through an interdisciplinary framework drawing on Indigenous ecocriticism, queer ecologies, and material ecocriticism, in this presentation I will discuss sculptural installations by Colombian multimedia artist Maria Fernanda Cardoso and two films by Argentine filmmaker Lucia Puenzo. Cardoso's works uncover indigenous ritual symbolism and knowledge about sexuality and ecology developed by Chibcha-speaking Muisca people of Colombia, while materializing overlapping histories of social and environmental exploitation in the northern Andes. In a similar fashion, the indigenous and queer protagonists of Puenzo's films denaturalize gender categories and heteronormative constructions of kinship while resisting legacies of colonization and resource extraction in the Southern Cone. In light of these recent examples of Latin American cultural production, I argue that more than human queer performativities help us envision unexpected landscapes of multi-species flourishing and decolonial environmental justice beyond the inequities of the Anthropocene. Art in Latin America draws on a long history linking scientific methodologies with artistic practice. Many European naturalists and explorers such as Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, and the Spanish botanist José Celestino Mutis, who is the one who introduced Humboldt to the region that is now Colombia, combined scientific analysis, empiricism, and artistic production in works such as those pictured here, Darwin's geological observations on South America, and Celestino Mutis's botanical illustrations. These figures documented the organisms, geological formations, and local knowledges they encountered throughout the Americas through detailed drawings and illustrations while collecting specimens to fill the museums of colonizing nations. Such early documentation of Latin America's rich biodiversity and natural resources became tied up in the extractive colonial practices that led to the displacement and subjugation of indigenous peoples and the destruction of species and ecosystems. In this sense, the ties between the classification of nature, colonialism, and heteronormativity run deep. Linda Burke and Luciana Parisi demonstrate that the prevailing biological classification system developed by Carl Linnaeus in the early 18th century relied heavily on patriarchal concepts of gender and sexuality prevalent during his time, while simultaneously reinforcing anthropocentric and racist notions of certain humans as superior to other beings. Furthermore, the entire taxonomic rank of species is predicated on reproductive imperatives. Gathering up the sensibilities of Myra J. Hurd, Donna Haraway, Joan Roughgarden, Bruce Bagamill, Stacia Limo, and others working in the burgeoning field of queer ecologies, Catriona Mortimer Sandilands and Bruce Erickson argue in their introduction to Queer Ecologies, Sex, Nature, Politics, Desire, that reprocentrism has enacted a series of, quote, sleights of narrative hand by which non-reproductive sexual acts are rendered necessarily irrelevant, secondary, or degenerate in relation to reproductive sex, end quote. And furthermore, gender dimorphic heterosexuality is seen to take precedence as the only natural sexual possibility. While Maria Fernanda Cardoso may be best known for the playful Cardoso flea circus and the large-scale research project, which may not be too safe for work, Museum of Copulatory Organs, Her earlier projects merit just as much attention for their exposure of these problematic linkages among classification, patriarchy, species extinction, and colonization. On the occasion of the second Bienal of Bogotá in 1990, Cardoso exhibited a collection of sculptural pieces composed of taxidermied amphibians, reptiles, fish, and insects arranged with wire into varying geometric shapes, hung on walls or suspended in the air. In Corona para una princesa chibcha, or Crown for a Chibcha princess, a ring of lizards hangs from a thin metal arch. The empty space below the crown highlights the absence of the crown's intended wearer. After repeated European expeditions into the northern Andes and the subsequent Spanish conquest of present-day Colombia, indigenous communities found themselves subjugated through the encomienda system, forced to work in gold mines and perform hard agricultural labor to support the expanding colonies. Abel Fernando Martínez Martín and Eduard Javier Manrique Corredor document the deleterious impact such exploitive practices had on Muisca, Chibcha-speaking Muisca society and culture, as well as the resulting ecological destruction and species extinctions that swept the northern Andes. The titular Chibcha princess in Cardoso's piece and the histories of colonial and ecological violence that have led to the near erasure of her community are strikingly present in this work because of the princess's physical absence. When read through Derrida's notion of trace, the space below the crown becomes a mark of the absence of a presence, an always already absent present. In addition, the lizards' preserved bodies provocatively foreground the ways in which the colonization, displacement, and exploitation of indigenous peoples are intimately linked to historical and contemporary processes of ecological destruction, resource extraction, and species extinction. Understandably, many critics of Cardoso's work take issue with her use of taxidermy. However, I would argue that, far from gratuitous, this technique enacts a deliberate cultural critique of the natural sciences' historical obsession with collecting and preserving specimens, while deconstructing through a queer frame the heteronormative semiotics of the Natural History Museum, whose displays those specimens filled. As much an art as a science, taxidermy began to flourish in Europe and the United States around 1890, when the demand for dioramas featuring whole, lifelike organisms rapidly increased at institutions such as the American Museum of Natural History and the British Museum. And here we see an example of Carl Ackley's gorilla diorama at the Museum of Natural History in New York. As Donna Haraway explains in Primate Visions, specimens were often arranged in species-specific family groups consisting of one female and one or two offspring centered around a large, virile male, the lead actor in a carefully staged morality play, reinforcing hierarchical, heteronormative, and reprocentric conceptions of nature and society. While Cardoso's sculptural groupings at the 1990 Biennale are also species-specific, her arrangement of taxidermied animals in rings and webs and other geometric shapes provocatively queers the heteronormative visual semiotics of natural history museum displays while disrupting reprocentric constructions of family and kinship. The pieces also reflect differing understandings of gender and sexuality among Chibcha-speaking people for whom traditions of kuzmos, or men gendered as women, and as well as homoerotic behavior well predate the first time of European contact. In addition, Cardoso's chosen organisms, diverse species of amphibians, reptiles, insects, and fish, evoke what Bruce Bagamill calls biological exuberance by highlighting the pervasiveness of hermaphroditic and asexual configurations in the animal world. Like Cardoso's installations, the hybrid figures and multi-species encounters in Lucia Puenzo's films work against heterosexist, patriarchal, and colonial matrices of power, while deconstructing normative gender categories that dictate which bodies and practices are considered acceptable and which are vilified as monstrous or unnatural. While there is a great deal I would like to say about both of these films, in the interest of time I will focus on a few key scenes from each of them. Puenzo's directing debut, XXY, or XXY, centers on Alex, a biologically intersex subject who bravely resists societal and familial demands to choose one sex over another, instead refusing to undergo invasive pharmaceutical and surgical treatments to correct his or her, quote, unnatural, unquote, body. The film engages directly and critically with Western forms of biological categorization as evinced by its title, the chromosomal genotype of someone with Klinefelter syndrome, which is one form of biological intersexuality. In the opening sequence of the film, shots of Alex running through the woods waving a machete and slicing at the earth cut to a graphic image of XXY chromosomes, the Y's jagged corner suggesting that it was made by severing one leg of an X. This severed third chromosome makes a profound statement against the privileging of genetic determinism as a basis for the classification of sexual difference. Feminist science scholars such as Donna Haraway, Sarah Richardson, and others propose rejecting the genomic construction of biological sex altogether in favor of a more sophisticated framework, quote, and I'm quoting Richardson here, that recognizes the non-binary and diverse nature of biological expressions of sex, both genotypic and phenotypic, end quote. Working outside these binary constraints, when faced with the decision whether to become male or female later in the film, Alex chooses not to choose at all. Rather than submit to a classificatory system that only offers false options, Alex proposes the provocative question, ¿Y si no hay nada para elegir? And if there's nothing to choose? And instead, she prefers to, as decolonial theorist Alejandro Villegas suggests, think in radical exteriority to systems of power. Like the endangered sea turtles and other organisms found on the Uruguayan island where the film takes place, Alex flourishes in interstitial spaces, sandy beaches, rocky shorelines, crystalline tide pools, that emphasize not only the blurry contact zones between species of many kinds, but also the multiple sexualities of creatures that are not quite aquatic, not quite terrestrial, not quite animal, and not totally vegetal. Within this frame of biological exuberance, XXY draws connections among dimorphic constructions of sexuality, the taxonomic categorization of species, and histories of colonial oppression. When Alex finds his or her friend Alvaro sketching un bicho raro, or a weird bug that he captured on the beach, he asks Alex what kind of insect it is. Alex furiously smashes the beetle while yelling, ¿Qué sabes vos de las especies de mi casa? What do you know about the species of my home? Expressing indignation at the brutal affinities between classification and oppression, and alluding to the region's violent colonial histories. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the indigenous Guarani, who still live and speak their language throughout present-day Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, were forced by Spanish encomenderos into hard labor extracting agricultural mineral resources and were captured in massive numbers by Portuguese bandeirantes for sale in the global slave trade. As Linda Burke and Parisi contend, early explorers and naturalists often classified new species using names that reinforced this kind of European racism and imperialism while simultaneously erasing sophisticated knowledge systems developed by indigenous peoples about local ecosystems, biodiversity, sexual diversity, and climate cycles. Indigenous languages, knowledge systems, and symbolic narratives play a somewhat larger role in Puenzo's second film, El Niño Pez, or The Fish Child, which dramatizes the romantic involvement between Lala Bronte, the daughter of a prominent Buenos Aires judge, and Aileen, a bisexual Guarani domestic worker from Paraguay, who was wrongfully accused of murder. We discovered through one of the film's many flashbacks that Aileen, after being raped by her father as a teenager, she gave birth to a fish-like child who could only breathe underwater. Unable to care for this trans-species being, which Aileen calls Nitaipira in Guarani, Aileen releases the baby in Lake Ipoa, where her community, members of her community begin to leave gifts and make prayers to this semi-mythical creature. This fish child, which becomes one of the centerpieces of the film, confounds the fluid lines between human and non-human while suggesting non-normative familial configurations untethered to species or gender categories. Furthermore, the Mitai Pira also evokes stories told by Umbia Guarani communities of Paraguay, Brazil, and parts of Argentina about piragi, an anthropomorphic aquatic being believed to protect bodies of water and the fish that inhabit these. These communities describe piragi as an amphibious being, masculine and or feminine, who draws greedy fishermen into the depths. Like Puenzo's trans-species fish child, piragi began as a human being unable to thrive in the open air. Contemporary Umbia accounts emphasize that boundary-crossing beings such as piragi and the ecological knowledges codified in the stories which surround these kinds of figures constitute sophisticated, long-standing ways of knowing and understanding the world. In conjunction with uncovering Umbia Guarani understandings of human-non-human continuity, the fish child's trans-species hybridity deconstructs deterministic concepts of species with clearly delineable genetic boundaries. Recent discoveries in genetics and evolutionary biology render it increasingly difficult to classify species based on their genomes. For example, Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan theorize that much of our genes emerged, in fact, through the continual exchange of genetic material across species lines, through horizontal gene transfer, symbiogenesis, and other processes at the cellular level. They argue that these forbidden couplings, as they say, which I see as queer couplings, multi-species couplings, tell the real story of our genetic becomings. In this light, XXY and the fish child reflect a growing sense of the inadequacy of the gene fetishistic categorizational systems that attempt to differentiate among members of different species and sexes. Rather than reinforcing heterosexist discourses about the natural, the rich biological and sexual diversity depicted in Puenzo's films and Cardoso's installations evokes multiple sexual configurations and social interactions throughout the non-human world and function to denaturalize gender categories and monolithic heteronormative constructions of kinship while vindicating radically exterior modes of thinking and being. Cardoso's unusual specimens on display and the trans-species beings in Puenzo's films engage in encounters across what Donna Haraway calls contact zones, in which processes of becoming with make, quote, a mess out of categories in the making of kin and kind, end quote. Cardoso's bioregional focus on the northern Andes and Puenzo's attention to lands in the southern cone underscore the extent to which human and non-human species are mutually implicated in both local and global dynamics of colonialism and patriarchy in the age of the Anthropocene. Cardoso's and Puenzo's works forge more sustainable and equitable coalitions beyond planetary collapse by mapping the intersections of biological diversity and sexual diversity while uncovering the queer, knotted, messy becomings of human and non-human species. Thanks for watching. Here are my works cited and my image credits.